The biggest thefts in history never touched a vault. A company with its own army twice the size of Britain's. An airline that once carried popes and presidents, gone from the departures board in a single afternoon. And a man who lent entire governments money until someone finally opened his vault and found nothing real inside it at all. One company, every barrel. John D. Rockefeller did not drill a single well to build the most feared company in America. He built pipelines, refineries, and shipping deals backed by secret rebates, quiet discounts railroads paid back only to Standard Oil until competitors either sold out or ran out of money. Standard Oil bought failing refiners for pennies, folded them into one machine, and by 1904 controlled nearly 9 of every 10 barrels refined in the country. Estimates place Rockefeller's fortune at its peak near $900 million, worth something close to $400 billion today, more than most Fortune 500 companies are worth combined. Farmers, shopkeepers, and small refiners called it an octopus, arms reaching into every state, squeezing prices from both ends. Washington finally noticed. Government lawyers spent 8 years building a case around those secret shipping deals no rival could match. In May 1911, the Supreme Court ordered Standard Oil broken into 34 separate companies. Rockefeller, retired and playing golf, reportedly told his caddy to buy shares in every piece. He was right. The pieces, sold apart, were worth more than the whole company had ever been. The business that swallowed its rivals became the reason the government now has the power to break apart the next one. A company that sold nothing. Every investor in London in 1720 knew the name South Sea Company, a firm granted a royal monopoly on trade with Spanish America. Trade that barely existed because Spain still controlled the ports. None of that stopped the shares. The company offered to take over Britain's national debt in exchange for stock, and speculation did the rest. Shares priced at £128 in January climbed past £1,000 by August, a rise equal to 10 years of a skilled tradesman's wages gained in a single summer. Sir Isaac Newton, a man who understood gravity better than almost anyone alive, sold his shares early for a tidy profit, then watched the price keep climbing and bought back in near the top. He lost around £20,000, a sum close to what a wealthy merchant might earn across an entire career. By September, confidence cracked. Directors and insiders had already sold out before the worst of it hit. Parliament opened an inquiry and found company officers had bribed ministers and forged subscription lists to inflate demand. Several directors had their estates seized to repay investors. Newton later admitted he could predict the movement of planets far more easily than the behavior of a crowd. The company that promised an empire of trade left behind a lesson about crowds instead. The Empire with no crown. Robert Clive arrived in India as a clerk for the East India Company and left decades later having reshaped a continent without ever wearing a crown. The company began as traders chartered by the English crown in 1600, importing tea, textiles, and spices. Over 2 centuries, it stopped trading and started ruling, collecting taxes, minting coins, and raising its own soldiers. Its annual revenue from Indian taxes alone reportedly topped £30 million a year at the company's height, rivaling the entire British government's own budget. By the mid-1800s, the company's private army numbered around 260,000 men, roughly twice the size of the regular British army back home. Clive himself was recalled to London to face a parliamentary inquiry into his conduct in India, cleared of the harshest charges but never regaining his old reputation, and he died in 1774. The arrangement held until 1857, when Indian soldiers under company command rose in rebellion against the institution paying them. The uprising was crushed, but it exposed how strange the setup had become. A private business ruling a continent through its own soldiers and courts. Parliament stripped the company of its territories and, by 1874, dissolved what remained of it through a single act. An army twice the size of its home countries was unwound by a single act of Parliament that most Britons never read. The airline that flew presidents. A Pan-American ticket once meant something a rival airline's ticket did not. First jet service across the Atlantic, the first passenger flights to circle the globe, a blue globe logo stitched onto nearly every aviation milestone for 60 years. Pan Am carried astronauts' families to launches, flew popes and presidents, and built the terminal other airlines tried to copy. But the company had never owned domestic routes inside the United States, and when deregulation opened American skies to competition in the late 1970s, Pan Am had no home turf to retreat to. Fuel prices spiked, fare wars ate into revenue, and a bombing over Lockerbie, Scotland in December 1988 brought lawsuits the company could not absorb alongside the losses. A Pan Am flight attendant with 2 decades of seniority believed the airline's name alone would would keep it flying, the way it always had. By 1991, the company owed creditors close to $2.5 billion, enough to have bought nearly 20 more of its own jumbo jets. On December 4th, 1991, Pan Am grounded its last flight and shut down for good, and the flight attendant was laid off along with thousands of others. Pan Am had once symbolized American arrival in every foreign city. It vanished from the departures board in a single afternoon. The Match King. He controlled roughly 3/4 of the world's match production from factories on 4 continents, and investors trusted him enough to hand him money by the trainload. Ivar Kruger built his empire from a simple trade, a monopoly on matches in one country in return for a loan to that country's government. Poland, Germany, and France all borrowed from Kruger in the 1920s, and he collected monopoly rights in return. He lent European governments the equivalent of several $billion in today's money he raised by selling bonds to ordinary investors in Sweden and the United States, who trusted his reputation more than his balance sheet. What no one could see was that his reputation was what held the loans together and not the reverse. When the 1929 crash dried up new investors, Kruger needed fresh cash to keep older debts looking paid, so he began forging Italian government bonds to show as assets on his own books. On March 12, 1932, Kruger was found dead in his Paris apartment. Investigators opened his company's vault soon after and found the forged bonds, along with a paper empire that had been running on borrowed trust for years. The man who had once lent money to entire countries had, in the end, been borrowing against a fiction only he could see. The bank sold for £1. Nick Leeson worked as a derivatives trader for Barings Bank in Singapore, placing bets on which direction the Japanese stock market would move next. Barings was Britain's oldest merchant bank, 232 years old, financier to the Bank of England itself and once to the British monarchy. Leeson's early trades made money, so his managers in London gave him more room and less oversight, letting him both make the trades and check his own paperwork. When his bets started losing, he hid the losses in a secret account instead of reporting them, then doubled down to try to win the money back before anyone noticed. An earthquake in Kobe, Japan in January 1995 sent the market moving against him harder than any single trade could fix. By the time London understood what had happened, the unauthorized trades had lost the bank close to £830 million, more than its entire capital reserves. Barings collapsed and was sold to a Dutch bank for £1 single, less than the cost of the coffee Leeson drank at his desk that morning. Leeson was arrested trying to fly home, extradited to Singapore, and spent 4 years in prison there. The rule that now requires banks to keep traders and the people who check their books in separate hands exists because Barings did not. The ledger that lied. A single accounting decision turned WorldCom from a company losing money into one of the most profitable telecommunications firms in America, at least on paper. WorldCom had grown through the 1990s by buying up smaller phone and internet companies, piling up debt investors tolerated as long as the stock kept climbing. When the routine costs of running phone lines started eating into the profits Wall Street expected, the finance team began booking those costs as long-term investments instead of ordinary expenses, spreading them out over years rather than counting them right away. The trick hit around $11 billion in expenses, an amount close to what the entire company had spent building its network across 4 continents. Cynthia Cooper, WorldCom's head of internal audit, grew suspicious of unexplained entries in the company's books and began digging through records late at night with her own small team, without telling her bosses what she had found. What she uncovered was the fraud that had been holding up the stock price for 2 years. She took it straight to the company's board, bypassing the finance executives who had built the scheme. WorldCom filed for bankruptcy in July 2002, the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history at the time. WorldCom had hidden its costs from Wall Street for 2 years. It could not hide them from one auditor with a spreadsheet. The empire built on fruit. In 1980, Asil Nadir took over a small textile company called Polypec and turned it into one of the fastest-growing conglomerates on the London Stock Exchange. Over the following decade, Polypec expanded into fruit packing, electronics, and hotels across Cyprus and Turkey, and its share price rose so quickly that London fund managers fought for allocations. By 1989, the company was valued at close to £2 billion, more than the market value of British Airways at the time. Much of that value sat inside operations in northern Cyprus, a region most outside investors had never visited and could not independently check. In 1990, regulators began investigating irregular transfers of company money into Nadir's personal accounts and into businesses he controlled outside London's reach. Auditors found gaps between what the company reported and what its Cypriot operations could account for, gaps perhaps running into tens of millions of pounds. Nadir fled Britain for northern Cyprus before trial, staying out of reach of British courts for 17 years. He finally returned in 2010, stood trial, and was convicted of theft in 2012, sentenced to 10 years for stealing from the business he himself had built into one of Britain's great fortunes. Blood tests that never worked. A device the size of a desktop printer was supposed to run hundreds of medical tests from a single drop of blood pricked from a fingertip. No needles, no vials, no waiting days for lab results. Elizabeth Holmes founded Theranos in 2003 after leaving Stanford as a sophomore, and by the mid-2010s, she had convinced board members, investors, and pharmacy chains that the technology worked. At its most valuable point, investors priced Theranos at $9 billion, and Holmes's personal stake was worth close to half of that on paper, a fortune that existed only as long as no one asked to see the machine actually run the tests it promised. The machine mostly could not. Behind the scenes, Theranos ran most patient samples on standard commercial lab equipment quietly bought from other companies, then presented the results as though its own device had produced them. Doctors made treatment decisions based on results the company knew were unreliable. A newspaper investigation in 2015 began pulling the story apart thread by thread, prompting regulators to test the machines themselves and find them wanting. Theranos dissolved in 2018. Holmes was convicted of investor fraud in 2022 and began an 11-year prison sentence, a paper fortune of $9 billion, ending in a sentence far less impressive to write down. Profits that were never real. In 2001, Enron collapsed so fast that employees who had spent decades building their retirement around company stock lost most of it within a matter of weeks. Enron had grown from a regional pipeline company into what Wall Street called the most innovative company in America, trading energy contracts and, eventually, almost anything that could be assigned a price. Its finance team used a method called mark-to-market accounting, booking the value of long-term deals as immediate profit the day a contract was signed, years before any of that money actually arrived. When actual cash never caught up to the profits on paper, executives hid the growing gap inside a maze of off-the-books partnerships that kept billions of dollars of debt off Enron's own balance sheet. The stock climbed past $90 a share, while employees were encouraged, and in some cases required, to hold company stock inside their retirement accounts. An Enron employee nearing retirement watched an account once worth several $100,000 shrink to almost nothing in a matter of weeks. By December 2001, Enron filed for what was then the biggest corporate collapse the country had ever recorded. Investigators later found that some senior executives had sold off their own Enron shares in the months before the collapse, cashing out the same stock they had urged employees to keep buying until the very end. Which of these empires surprised you most? Tell us in the comments and subscribe for more stories of the businesses that once ruled the world.